Under the grey Atlantic sky on Friday, 18 October 1940, during the early and violent middle years of World War II, the long columns of merchant ships in convoy SC-7 pushed westward from the British Isles, their bows rising and falling against heavy swells, while the crews on watch scanned the horizon for shadows that were almost impossible to see. The day had begun in routine silence, with engines thudding, signal lamps flashing brief messages between escorts, and the cold wind cutting across decks that smelled of salt, diesel, and nervous anticipation. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single event, but a relentless and grinding struggle for survival and supply, and this day, like so many others, was shaped by the strategy that German Naval Command called Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack tactic, in which scattered submarines shadowed convoys and then concentrated for coordinated night attacks. Despite dramatic phrases that decades later would exaggerate the scale of destruction into legends of 50 ships sunk in one night, the historical reality is more complex, more human, and far more sobering, because the real horror of the battle did not depend on mythic numbers, but on the lived fear and loss experienced one ship at a time, one torpedo at a time, across long hours of darkness in the cold mid-ocean gap where no aircraft could yet provide cover. By the afternoon of that same day, German U-boats, under the command structure of Admiral Dönitz, had already begun shadowing SC-7 using radio coordination and disciplined silence, carefully tracking the convoy's zigzag course while they waited for nightfall, which provided both tactical advantage and psychological shock. The merchant crews, many of them civilians with only basic naval training, relied on the British and Allied escorts that were too few in number and often stretched across long distances, struggling to protect dozens of vulnerable ships arranged in columns that formed a vast and tempting target field. When darkness finally closed across the sea, the first coordinated attacks began, not as a single explosive moment of destruction, but as waves of stealthy approaches and sudden eruptions of fire and water through the night. Torpedoes struck tankers and freighters in terrifying sequence, hulls split open, oil spread across the surface, and burning reflections lit the clouds while distress calls merged with shouted orders and the hiss of steam. Historical records show that across the nights of 18 and 19 October, and in connection with related attacks on convoy HX-79, dozens of ships were sunk over successive hours and engagements, creating one of the most devastating convoy disasters of World War II. And although it did not literally amount to 50 ships lost in a single night, the cumulative destruction felt endless to those who survived. The educational importance of this moment lies in understanding how tactics, technology, and strategic doctrine interacted with human vulnerability, rather than reducing events to dramatic slogans. Each submarine in the Wolfpack was operated by a small crew working in cramped, diesel-filled compartments, enduring cold, darkness, and constant danger while navigating by sound and calculation. The U-boat captains maneuvered on the surface at night, blending into the sea, timing their approaches to slip between columns and fire at close range before retreating into blackness, often returning again and again during the same night. On board the merchant ships, gunners fired blindly into shadows, lookouts strained to detect incoming wakes, and lifeboats were lowered into freezing water while escorts attempted to chase attackers they could barely locate. The reality of the battle was one of chaos that still followed patterns shaped by strategy. The limited escort screen, the absence of air cover far from land, and the advantage granted to submarines by coordinated night surface attacks. Through this lens, historians study not only the number of ships destroyed, but the transformation of naval doctrine, the adaptation of escort tactics, and the eventual shift toward better radar, improved convoy protection, and long-range patrol aircraft that would gradually erode the dominance of the Wolfpack. When dawn rose after the worst of the attacks, survivors clung to rafts, debris, and oil-coated life preservers, watching smoke drift above the horizon while damaged ships burned or slipped beneath the waves. Rescue operations were desperately slow because escorts had to balance the duty of saving lives with the responsibility of defending the remaining conv, and every maneuver risked new attacks from submarines still lurking nearby. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, carried the wreckage away while signals were transmitted back to Allied command, where officers confronted grim lists of names, tonnage, and cargo lost. The historical record shows that convoys like SC-7 and HX-79 were carrying not only fuel and raw materials, but also food, machinery, mail, and the fragile psychological link between nations fighting across oceans. The loss of so many ships across successive nights did not simply represent numbers on charts. It affected morale, strained logistics, and forced military planners to confront the urgent need for more escorts, better coordination, and new technological innovation. In classroom discussions and historical analysis, these events are used to illustrate how strategic weaknesses become visible only when tested by sustained pressure, and how adaptation in wartime often emerges from painful lessons paid for in blood and steel. From the German perspective, the success of the Wolfpack operations in this period strengthened confidence in the strategy and reinforced the belief that concentrated U-boat action could break Allied supply lines and force Britain toward exhaustion. Yet even within that temporary advantage, there were limits and costs, because each submarine operated under constant threat from depth charges, mechanical breakdowns, and the increasing sophistication of Allied detection methods. The educational value of examining these contrasting experiences lies in recognizing that warfare at sea during World War II was an evolving contest of learning cycles, where each tactical innovation provoked a countermeasure, and where victories in one season often carried the seeds of vulnerability in the next. As Allied scientists and naval officers studied convoy disasters, they reformed escort groups, emphasized cooperative defense, and eventually introduced support groups that could chase submarines aggressively rather than remain tied exclusively to convoy formation. Long-range aircraft, high-frequency direction finding, and better radar slowly reshaped the balance of power, turning nighttime into a less favorable environment for U-boats, and reducing the chances of repeated large-scale Wolfpack attacks of the type that had devastated convoys in 1940 and 1941. In reflecting on the myth of one Wolfpack sinking 50 ships overnight, historians emphasize that the truth of the Battle of the Atlantic does not require exaggeration to convey its intensity or significance. The real events, spread across successive nights, multiple convoys, and repeated encounters, already reveal a brutal contest where human endurance, fear, and courage collided with strategy and technology under unforgiving conditions. Understanding these events in an educational and historically accurate context allows us to see the individuals behind the numbers. The sailors who worked engine rooms deep below deck, the signalmen who transmitted final messages, the escort commanders forced to make impossible choices, and the submarine crews who celebrated tactical victories while knowing that their own lives were constantly at risk. By studying these episodes carefully, we gain insight into how maritime warfare shaped the outcome of World War II, how logistics and supply determined strategic capacity, and how the Atlantic became both a graveyard and a lifeline for nations struggling to survive. The story of these convoy battles remains powerful not because of inflated legends, but because it shows, in stark and painful detail, how a war of ships and submarines could decide the fate of continents. In the wider historical framework of World War II, the events surrounding the devastating convoy battles of 1940 and 1941 marked a turning point in how both sides understood the nature of maritime warfare. The Atlantic Ocean, stretching between continents, was more than a geographic space. It was a strategic artery through which industrial power, manpower, and material support flowed. The British Isles depended on merchant shipping not only for military supplies, but for food, oil, and the essentials of civilian survival, and each convoy that crossed the Atlantic represented both logistical necessity and profound risk. German naval leadership recognized this dependence and believed that, by relentlessly attacking supply lines, they could apply sustained economic and psychological pressure that might isolate Britain and weaken its ability to continue the war. The Wolfpack strategy was therefore not simply a tactical innovation, but an attempt to transform maritime conflict into a campaign of attrition aimed at the very foundation of Allied endurance. The ships that composed these convoys came from many nations and backgrounds: British, Norwegian, Dutch, Greek, Canadian, and others, and their crews reflected a diverse mix of professional sailors, wartime volunteers, merchant mariners, and young men who had only recently learned their trade at sea. Their daily routines were shaped by discipline, monotony, and constant vigilance, as they stood watch through wind and darkness, listening to engines and scanning empty horizons while knowing that unseen submarines might be tracking them. Life aboard a merchant ship in convoy required endurance, because cramped quarters, limited heat, and exposure to storms combined with the psychological strain of knowing that a single torpedo could destroy the ship without warning. Educational study of these conditions helps us understand that the Battle of the Atlantic was not fought only by admirals and strategists, but by thousands of ordinary sailors whose experiences were defined by uncertainty and fear, yet also by resilience and commitment to their essential role in the war effort. On the other side of the conflict, the crews of the U-boats also lived under extreme and demanding conditions that shape our understanding of how the Wolfpack operated in practice. Each submarine carried a small and tightly organized crew that worked in confined spaces filled with machinery, fuel fumes, and condensation, where bunks were shared in shifts and privacy was almost non-existent. Patrols could last weeks or months, and while early war operations often gave submarines the advantage in nighttime surface attacks, every engagement carried the risk of counterattack by escorts or bombers near coastal regions. When historians examine the tactics of the Wolfpack, they emphasize that coordinated attacks relied not only on strategic planning from naval command, but also on the discipline and endurance of submarine crews who had to shadow convoys for long periods before joining in nighttime assaults. Understanding this dual perspective, both merchant sailor and submariner, allows students of history to see the Battle of the Atlantic as a complex human contest rather than a simplified narrative of winners and losers. As Allied naval leadership reviewed the disastrous losses suffered by convoys such as SC-7 and HX-79, they began to recognize systemic weaknesses in convoy defense that had developed out of necessity rather than design. Escort vessels were often too few, dispersed too widely, and equipped with early detection systems that struggled to identify submarines operating on the surface at night. The educational significance of these lessons lies in how they illustrate the process of wartime adaptation, in which tragic and costly experiences forced rapid innovation in technology, doctrine, and international cooperation. British naval thinkers, working alongside Canadian and later American command structures, began to reorganize escort groups into more cohesive units, assigning them to convoys not as temporary attachments, but as trained teams capable of coordinated defense. Over time, this shift helped transform escorts from reactive responders into proactive defensive forces that could engage U-boats more effectively. Technological progress played a central role in reshaping the balance of power in the Atlantic. The development of improved radar, high-frequency direction finding systems, and more reliable sonar devices gradually reduced the freedom that submarines had previously enjoyed during nighttime operations. Long-range aircraft, operating from bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and later the Azores, began to close the notorious mid-ocean gap where convoys had once been unprotected from the air. Educational analyses of this transformation show that victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was not the result of a single breakthrough, but of many incremental advances in science, engineering, and communication that together changed the strategic environment. Each new escort carrier, each improved weapon system, and each refined convoy doctrine represented a response to earlier failures that had revealed where defenses were weakest. The human experience of survivors from torpedoed ships offers another essential dimension to understanding this period of World War II. Many accounts describe how explosions tore through hulls in seconds, plunging engine rooms into darkness and filling corridors with smoke and seawater. Men scrambled to reach lifeboats or rafts while flames burned across oil-slicked water, and others were thrown into the sea with little more than life preservers to keep them afloat in freezing conditions. Time moved slowly in such moments, as survivors clung to debris, recited prayers, or called out in the night for comrades who had vanished beneath waves. Escort vessels faced agonizing choices because every minute spent rescuing survivors exposed them to renewed submarine attack, yet countless sailors nevertheless risked their own safety to pull others from the water. Studies of these testimonies remind us that behind every statistic of tonnage lost or ships sunk were individual stories of courage, suffering, and loss that shaped family histories and national memory long after the war ended. From a strategic perspective, the German Naval Command viewed the intense convoy battles of 1940 and 1941 as evidence that the Wolfpack doctrine could exert decisive pressure on Allied supply lines. Early successes reinforced the belief that concentrated submarine operations, supported by coordinated radio communication and centralized direction, might eventually overwhelm escort defenses. However, as the war progressed, the same radio transmissions that allowed Wolfpacks to gather also enabled Allied intelligence and direction-finding services to track submarine movements more effectively. Educational inquiry into this period highlights the dynamic nature of technological warfare, where every innovation opens opportunities but also introduces vulnerabilities. The Wolfpack system remained formidable, but its reliance on coordination increasingly drew it into a wider intelligence contest that shaped the subsequent phases of the Atlantic conflict. The Battle of the Atlantic ultimately became a story of endurance measured across years rather than weeks, and its outcome was determined by industrial resilience, international cooperation, and the capacity to learn from failure. The events that inspired dramatic legends of 50 ships sunk overnight serve as focal points for examining how fear, rumor, and memory interact with historical reality, but the deeper truth lies in recognizing the sustained pressure and cumulative loss endured by all sides. Educational exploration of these convoy battles helps students and researchers understand how maritime logistics underpinned the broader strategic framework of World War II, how supply lines carried both material and symbolic significance, and how the seemingly remote expanse of the Atlantic Ocean became one of the most decisive arenas of the war. By studying these events with care and historical accuracy, we not only honor those who lived and died in the conflict, but also gain insight into the ways strategy, technology, and human experience converge in times of global crisis. By late 1940, the psychological impact of the Wolfpack attacks had already begun to ripple across Allied merchant and naval communities. Every convoy departure was met with anxiety that extended far beyond the men on deck. Families, port authorities, and military planners all lived under the constant shadow of U-boat threat. British government propaganda underscored the peril while emphasizing the resilience required to maintain supply lines, framing merchant sailors as essential participants in a total war effort. Educational studies of morale in the Atlantic convoys reveal that fear was omnipresent, yet it coexisted with courage, ingenuity, and camaraderie. Sailors developed routines to cope with the stress, rotating watches to prevent exhaustion, memorizing emergency procedures, and forming informal support networks that could help men recover from traumatic encounters with destruction and loss at sea. From the German perspective, the Wolfpack doctrine was refined through a combination of practical experience and strategic innovation. Admiral Dönitz, who would later become Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, had emphasized coordinated attacks as a way to exploit numerical advantage against well-defended convoys. Submarines were spread across the convoy's projected path, sometimes tens of miles apart, to ensure that contact could be made and maintained over long distances. Once a convoy was sighted, the U-boat maintaining shadow contact would relay encrypted messages to command, allowing other submarines to converge under cover of night. This method demonstrated a high level of operational sophistication for the time, relying on disciplined timing, stealth, and precise execution. Yet it was also a system vulnerable to intelligence interception and operational error. Miscalculations in positioning, poor weather or misread signals could result in lost opportunities or exposure to counterattack. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1940, convoys such as SC-7 became case studies in both the effectiveness and limits of Wolfpack tactics. The attacks were methodical rather than instantaneous, unfolding across hours and often spilling into the early hours of the morning. Survivors recalled the eerie soundscape of the night, torpedo detonations echoing off waves, the creaking of ships straining against swells, distant shouts of crew members attempting to launch lifeboats, and the low hum of diesel engines as submarines maneuvered into firing positions. These experiences illustrate that the so-called overnight bloodbath was actually a drawn-out series of engagements that tested the endurance, decision-making, and training of both sailors and naval commanders. From an educational standpoint, these details emphasize the human dimension of strategy. Success or failure depended not only on tactics, but on the capacity of individuals to respond under pressure. Allied naval intelligence began to adapt quickly in response to repeated Wolfpack successes. The use of high-frequency direction finding HFDF or HFDF stations allowed escorts and shore commands to detect the radio transmissions of U-boats, effectively turning the German coordination system into a potential vulnerability. Convoy escort tactics also evolved. Groups of destroyers, corvettes, and later frigates were organized into support groups capable of independent anti-submarine operations rather than being tethered strictly to conv positions. These changes were informed directly by studying cases such as SC-7, in which insufficient escort coverage had allowed German submarines to operate with relative freedom. By analyzing ship positions, attack patterns, and timing of engagements, planners developed methods to anticipate U-boat movement, deploy counterattacks, and protect high-value ships, particularly tankers carrying oil vital to the war effort. The human cost of these engagements, however, remained staggering. Each ship lost meant not only the loss of vital supplies, but the potential death or injury of dozens of men. Lifeboats drifted in frigid waters for hours or even days before rescue. Some sailors were recovered after enduring hypothermia, exhaustion, and exposure. Others were never seen again. These losses created ripple effects in ports, recruitment centers, and morale across both military and civilian communities. Families learned of the dangers through telegrams and newspapers, and sailors returning from previous convoys carried with them stories that would both warn and inspire the next groups of volunteers. Educational studies of these effects highlight how warfare extends beyond the battlefield, shaping societies, policy decisions, and even industrial mobilization in profound ways. German U-boat crews, for their part, also endured extreme stress and risk. Each submarine had a limited supply of torpedoes, and every engagement carried the risk of counter-detection. Mechanical failures were common in the confined, salt-corroded environment of the submarine hull. Crew members worked in shifts that allowed no privacy, with limited nutrition and exposure to diesel fumes and humidity. The coordination required for successful Wolfpack operations meant that captains had to maintain absolute discipline and precise timing while navigating in darkness, often relying on charts and dead reckoning when visibility was poor. This human factor demonstrates that strategic success in the Atlantic was contingent on individual skill and resilience as much as on doctrine and planning. The cumulative effect of attacks like those on SC-7 and HX-79 forced Allied planners to rethink strategic priorities. Protecting supply lines became as critical as winning battles on land. Resources were shifted to escort vessel construction, sonar development, convoy routing, and air patrol coverage. International cooperation expanded as Canadian, American, and later Free French forces joined in convoy protection efforts. The Battle of the Atlantic thus became an example of systemic adaptation. Strategic doctrines evolved in response to both the successes and failures of previous engagements, and lessons learned were applied to increasingly sophisticated combined operations that would eventually turn the tide against the U-boat threat. By late 1941, the introduction of escort carriers, long-range reconnaissance aircraft, and improved anti-submarine weapons had begun to erode the operational freedom of the Wolfpack. The convoys became less vulnerable to sudden nighttime attacks and could now expect some form of aerial or surface protection in previously unguarded stretches of ocean. Historians analyzing these developments emphasize that technological adaptation, rather than brute force alone, determined the long-term outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. The story of early Wolfpack attacks, however, remains a crucial part of understanding this process. They exposed weaknesses, created urgency, and forced innovation that ultimately strengthened Allied naval power and logistical resilience. Educationally, these events provide insight into multiple dimensions of World War II. They illustrate the interplay between strategy, technology, and human endurance, the risks inherent in logistical operations, and the iterative nature of learning under wartime pressure. They also reveal the psychological intensity of prolonged maritime combat, where sailors had to maintain vigilance and discipline over extended periods under life-threatening conditions. In classrooms, museums, and scholarly research, these stories are used to explain how a single engagement or series of attacks can have ramifications far beyond the immediate loss of ships, affecting morale, industrial output, strategic planning, and international cooperation. The narrative of the Wolfpack attacks demonstrates a broader truth about warfare. Victory is rarely instantaneous, and losses are rarely contained to the battlefield. Convoy SC-7 exemplifies this, as its losses reverberated through ports, naval command centers, and civilian communities. Each torpedoed ship became a lesson for future operations, each survival a story of courage, and each sinking a reminder of the strategic importance of maritime supply. The human stories, combined with analysis of tactics and technology, provide a comprehensive view of how the Battle of the Atlantic shaped the trajectory of World War II. The operational patterns established during the early Wolfpack attacks of 1940 and 1941 became a blueprint for German naval strategy, demonstrating both the potential and the limitations of submarine warfare. German command meticulously analyzed convoy movements, calculating average speeds, zigzag patterns, and escort intervals. Each piece of intelligence fed into Dönitz's growing doctrine of concentrated night attacks, emphasizing that success depended on timing, positioning, and surprise. Yet even in these meticulously planned operations, environmental factors could disrupt precision. Fog, storms, and heavy seas complicated navigation, while sudden changes in convoy formation could force U-boats to improvise under the constant threat of detection. From an educational perspective, these details highlight how strategy is implemented in the real world, not as a static plan, but as a dynamic interaction between human decision-making, environmental conditions, and technological capability. In response to repeated convoy disasters, Allied naval planners also began incorporating predictive analysis into operational decisions. Rather than simply reacting to attacks as they occurred, commanders studied historical patterns, intelligence intercepts, and shipping logs to anticipate likely points of engagement. Routing convoys along less predictable paths, adjusting speeds, and varying escort formations became increasingly standard practice. The educational value of these adaptations is significant, illustrating the iterative process of military learning and the importance of feedback loops in operational planning. Strategic theory, once abstract, was tested and refined in real time, with lessons learned directly influencing the survival of thousands of sailors and the flow of critical wartime supplies. Technological innovation was another decisive factor that shaped the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. Early U-boat attacks relied heavily on the element of darkness and the limited detection capabilities of Allied ships. However, the introduction of radar, sonar, and HFDF equipment shifted the balance. Radar allowed escorts to detect surface submarines at greater distances and in poor visibility, while sonar provided underwater detection of submerged threats. HFDF enabled the interception of U-boat radio communications, turning the coordination system that had previously given German submarines an advantage into a vulnerability. These innovations highlight a core lesson of World War II, that technological adaptation was not merely supportive of strategy, but central to its success, and that victories often resulted from the effective integration of human skill and scientific advancement. The human dimension of the Atlantic campaign remained central throughout these developments. Sailors aboard both merchant ships and submarines endured harsh conditions that tested endurance, morale, and decision-making under stress. On merchant vessels, crew members faced freezing temperatures, constant vigilance, and the ever-present threat of sudden torpedo attacks. The psychological toll was severe. The anticipation of attack, the witnessing of shipmates lost to the sea, and the prolonged isolation of long voyages combined to create a climate of persistent stress. Historical accounts reveal that sailors developed coping mechanisms ranging from structured drills to informal camaraderie and mutual support, reinforcing the lesson that human resilience is as crucial to military effectiveness as equipment and strategy. Submarine crews experienced comparable pressures, albeit in different forms. The confined quarters of the U-boat, the persistent risk of depth-charge attack, and the need for precise execution of tactical plans created a high-intensity environment in which discipline was paramount. Captains and officers had to maintain morale, enforce procedures, and make instantaneous decisions in conditions of near-constant threat. Training, experience, and leadership quality were decisive factors in whether missions succeeded or failed. Educational studies of U-boat operations emphasize that strategy cannot be disentangled from human performance. Technical capability is effective only when combined with rigorous training, leadership, and morale management. The broader strategic implications of the Wolfpack campaigns were profound. Disruptions to Atlantic convoys threatened the supply of oil, ammunition, food, and industrial materials to Britain and its allies. Early successes emboldened German naval command and shaped broader war planning, while exposing the Allies to a crisis that demanded rapid and decisive responses. The necessity of protecting maritime supply lines became a guiding principle for Allied operational planning, influencing shipbuilding priorities, escort allocation, and the deployment of air reconnaissance assets. The Atlantic, in essence, became a central theater of World War II, where industrial capacity, technological innovation, and human courage intersected in a struggle that would determine the sustainability of the Allied war effort. Survivor accounts from torpedoed convoys add a personal dimension to the understanding of these campaigns. Men who endured sinkings described the chaos of explosions, the freezing waters, and the struggle to maintain life in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage. Many were rescued after hours or days, while others were lost to the sea, leaving families with uncertainty and grief. The psychological impact extended beyond those directly affected. News of losses spread rapidly among shipping communities, influencing recruitment, morale, and public perception of the war. In an educational context, these experiences illustrate that historical events are not abstract figures or charts. They are composed of lived experiences that shape both strategy and society. As the war progressed into 1942 and 1943, Allied adaptation began to shift the dynamics of the Atlantic. Long-range aircraft extended air cover into the mid-ocean gap, while escort carriers allowed for mobile air patrols that could intercept submarines before they reached optimal attack positions. Improved depth charges and forward-throwing anti-submarine weapons increased the risk to U-boats, and enhanced convoy organization reduced vulnerabilities. The Wolfpack tactic, while still potent, became increasingly constrained by Allied innovation. Educational analysis of this transition emphasizes the interplay of offense and defense in military technology. Each advance prompted a countermeasure, and success depended on continuous learning and adaptation. Strategically, the lessons of early convoy disasters like SC7 informed both planning and public policy. The scale of losses highlighted the vital importance of transatlantic supply lines, compelling governments to allocate resources for shipbuilding, escort deployment, and technological research. It also underscored the human cost of logistical failure, reinforcing the need to consider not just the efficiency of material transport, but the protection of personnel. From this perspective, the Atlantic campaign exemplifies the broader principle that warfare is as much about sustaining capacity and resilience as it is about achieving tactical victories. In considering the educational significance of the Wolfpack campaigns, it is essential to examine not only the events themselves, but the long-term implications for military strategy and doctrine. The Atlantic battles demonstrated that technological innovation, human performance, and strategic foresight are inseparable in determining outcomes. They reveal how intelligence, communication, and logistics are as critical as combat operations, and how failures in any of these domains can have cascading effects. The study of these events provides modern learners with insights into leadership, risk management, and the necessity of adaptive thinking under conditions of uncertainty and danger.